Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
We broadcast each week, and here today is my co-host, Karl Peterjohn. Remember, you can always find out more about these topics at my blog, The Voice for Liberty. That's at wichitaliberty.org. For most shows, I'll have a show notes page there. So if we talk about any documents, institutions, agencies, or whatever, I'll try to provide a link to that. So, Karl, we've got some news that's about national politics that's of interest to us here in Kansas, in Wichita in particular, which was on Monday. Our former congressman now, Mike Pompeo, was confirmed to be the director of the CIA. He was sworn in immediately, promptly resigned his seat. The governor, our Governor Brownback, has set Tuesday, April 11th, as special election day. So everybody can vote in that. And
everyone who's registered voters in the 4th Congressional District in South Central Kansas. Yes, in the 4th Congressional
Districts. The Republicans, Democrats, and Libertarians each need to hold nominating conventions to select their nominee. We know now today that the Republican Party will hold its meeting February 9th, a Thursday, 7 p.m., at the Friends University Davis Administration Building Auditorium. And that Davis building is the prominent tall building at Friends University with the clock tower that you can see from all over town. So that meeting is open to the public, but who can vote? Well, there's only 126 people who can vote to select the Republican nominee. I don't know how many there are for Democrats and Libertarians, but it's not a freewheeling primary. It's more like a convention, kind of.
It's a caucus, and just full disclosure, Bob, I am an alternate, which means I probably will not have a vote unless one of the delegates does not show up, and for whatever reason I would be picked to be replaced. But there are a large number of other alternates from each of the counties, and each county has at least 2 delegates and 2 alternates that can attend that are in the 4th Congressional District, and that covers a number of other counties: Butler, Harvey, Cowley, Sumner, Kingman, Harper, are all in the district, as well as several others that I haven't neglected to mention.
The Wichita metro area certainly dominates that that district. So anyway, that's coming up pretty soon. You know, another thing I was thinking with regard to Mike Pompeo, remember how after Trump was elected that we thought, oh, there's going to be this flood of Kansas people going to serve in the Trump administration. Mike Pompeo's done that. 2 other people that were prominently mentioned as perhaps getting top Washington jobs were our Governor Sam Brownback and Secretary of State Chris Kobach, but it doesn't seem like that's going to happen for either of those.
Well, I think that the jury's still out in terms of politically, Bob, because you've got to put the big picture into context. All the cabinet appointments, only 2 secretaries have actually been confirmed by.
Oh, that is right.
And even though President Trump has nominated a whole host of folks, there are approximately 4,000 presidential appointment positions now. Quite a few of these do not have to have Senate confirmation, but the top positions do. And if the secretaries haven't been appointed, the undersecretaries and assistant secretaries that are also political appointments that serve at the pleasure of the president, those folks haven't been selected, let alone going through the confirmation process.
That's a good point, Karl. There are a lot of points there.
And I'm going to throw out ambassadors too, because I know one of the positions that's been mentioned, if possibly for 2 of the folks that you mentioned, one of them would be an ambassadorship. And as far as I know, I have not heard of President Trump making any appointments to the ambassador positions.
Yeah. You know, I wouldn't mind being the ambassador to Italy, you know, based on the food there. That's where I would choose anyway. But there is another Kansan who was plucked up by the Trump administration, Ajit Pai. He is from Parsons, grew up in Parsons, Kansas. He's been a commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission for some time. Now he's been selected to be the chairman of that board. He spoke in Wichita a year ago last fall. I think you were there, Karl, weren't you?
Absolutely. I got a a chance to meet him. A very impressive young fellow.
And I'm not endorsing that there needs to be a Federal Communications Commission, but I think Commissioner Pai very much embraces free markets and and competition. And if we must have an FCC, I feel that he's a pretty good guy to head it.
Well, I think he's going to be looking at revising FCC policy, because the FCC is a fascinating body, Bob. By law, they have to have a mixture of both Republicans and Democrats on the body. And even though Mr. Pai was appointed by President Obama, he filled one of the Republican slots.
Yeah, by statute or something, there has to be a mix.
That is correct. And Mr. Pai has a strong history and record of working in the telecommunications industry, and is very tech savvy, and I think is going to be restructuring the policy, although albeit there are appointments that President Trump has to make onto the FCC. There's at least one, and I believe maybe even two vacant positions right now.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. Carl, we've got a big item in Kansas politics still. Let's take that up right after this break. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and he's Karl Peterjohn. Karl, there was some other, really, I think, pretty big political news in Kansas this week. We all knew that, or at least we thought, and I think she even said that, Lynn Jenkins, the congressman from the 2nd District of Kansas, that's Topeka and on down through southeast Kansas, that she was going to run for governor next year to replace Sam Brownback. He'll be out due to term limits. But this week she had an announcement, and this was her on her Facebook page, I mean her own words, not just some reporting, saying that she's going to retire from political life at the end of this term in Congress and will not be running for governor for the state of Kansas. So I had heard that a lot of Republicans were stepping aside to pave the way for Lynn Jenkins to run for governor. A friend of mine on Facebook, who I think knows her, said, well, I can understand that. It's really tough being in office like that, especially leadership like she was. I can understand her being burned out. But I wrote, the cynic in me notices that the current governor is so unpopular, rightly or wrongly, that it might be difficult for any Republican to be elected governor next year.
Well, if you look at the Kansas history, Bob, we have a history of electing Democrats to governor of this state. Now, this is not totally unusual. At the moment, deeply Democratic states, I'll mention just two, Massachusetts and Maryland, both have Republican governors, and in fact Massachusetts has kind of a history of quite a few Republican governors going back in time. Well, Mitt Romney was one of the ones on the list, but going back to, Bill Weld, I'll even go back a little further, Calvin Coolidge. But having said that, you're looking at a situation where I think this is a true political surprise, because all the folks I'd been talking to had been saying she is lining up to make a run for governor. And I think this is going to be a resetting the race almost as much as if we have a situation which still could occur if Governor Brownback would be appointed to a federal position, and he would step down like his predecessor, Governor Sebelius, did in 2009.
Of course, if that happened, we know who exactly would be the new governor. It'd be Jeff Collier, the lieutenant governor, but then we'd have to select a lieutenant governor, and certainly being an incumbent is usually seen as an advantage, but I'm not so sure these days in Kansas. I mean, Governor Brownback is quite unpopular even amongst Republicans. Well,
I would say this, Bob. That's the conventional wisdom, just like the conventional wisdom was President Trump, albeit back then candidate Trump couldn't get elected.
Right.
And Governor Brownback, just as unpopular, according to all the pundits, in 2014, and albeit he did win re-election by a very, very narrow margin, but he did win.
Yes.
And so I think there'll be plenty of Republicans planning to throw their hat in the gubernatorial ring in next year.
Definitely some big egos up there. I mean, Derek Schmidt, Chris Kobach, Jeff Collier, I think, would look at that. I mean, the list, there's a lot of them up there who see themselves as governor.
Well, I think there are a variety of folks who could move up in terms of statewide office and also members of the congressional delegation.
Yeah. And the Democrats will have to choose a candidate. And I don't know, like 2 years ago, or it's been almost 3 years, Paul Davis did a pretty good job, and really, I think, put a scare into Governor Brownback. I was really quite surprised.
Well, I mean, it's a little bit unusual to have a person who has not been in statewide office, and Paul had only been elected to his state representative district in Douglas County, in Lawrence. Before, that was basically the extent of his electoral experience.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to have to see. I mean, the election, it seems like a long ways away, but the primary election where this Republican battle will be fought out is only about 18 months away, and then the election a couple months after that. So I think keep tuned, because I think there's going to be a lot of intense bargaining and campaigning going on. To top it off, the Kansas Republicans are holding their statewide convention in about 2 weeks, February 10th or 11th or something. So you can count on there's going to be, it'd be good to go up there, because those candidates who want votes, a lot of times they have some pretty big shrimp in their hospitality rooms. Maybe we should make a day trip up there.
Well, everybody comes out of that event, especially when there are candidates running for office. Nobody goes away hungry.
Yeah, and the day before that is when we have the nominating convention for the Congress seat down here. So there's quite a bit of action coming up.
For the Republican nomination only. Now, we don't know about the Democrats and Libertarians, and it's also possible with my petition drive you could have an independent candidate too.
Seems like the bar, I think it's 3,000, and you'd have to do it real fast. That seems like a very difficult proposition for someone to do.
Having collected signatures to get to qualify for the ballot, it's a huge challenge in the short period of time that they're going to have with the election in early April.
Exactly. Let's take another moment off. When we come back, I've got a few topics regarding school choice that I'd like to talk about. This is Bob Weeks on Wichita Liberty TV. Well, welcome back to another segment of Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me, Karl Peterjohn. This week, across the country, and here in Kansas too, it's School Choice Week, and that's an issue that's important to me. I've talked about it a lot on Wichita Liberty TV, but I think some people don't really understand, what does school choice mean? We have our traditional public schools, but then schools of choice, we would say private schools, charter schools, online schools, and homeschooling. I think that's about the vehicles for school choice, isn't it?
I think those are the main four.
And they can be implemented in this way. First of all, parents pay twice. I mean, a lot of opponents of school choice say, oh, you can send your kid to any school you want as long as you also pay for the government schools. You can also move to a district where the public schools may be better, I'll say that. And in Wichita, we have these suburban districts, Andover, Goddard, Mays, I think are the most prominent, that really encroach quite a bit into the city of Wichita. So you may live in East Wichita, but your kids go to the Andover School District because the district's in there.
Well, those boundaries were established well before the city of Andover grew and the city of Wichita grew
in there,
and so municipal annexations and school boundaries have absolutely no relationship under Kansas law, unlike some other states where they do.
Yeah. Parents can provide homeschooling, and that's, I think, an alternative that's growing in popularity. Not everyone may be able to do that financially. A lot of families feel that both parents need to work, but that's available. There are vouchers, tax credit scholarships, and now a relatively new innovation is education savings accounts, where the state gives the parents a certain amount of money for each child. They could then spend it on tuition at a private school or at a charter school, or even for homeschooling to buy curriculum and things like that, because some of those curricula that homeschoolers might use are pretty expensive, I think.
Well, that's part of the cost in terms of homeschooling, but having talked with parents who've homeschooled on and off, and some folks I know have done it from basically pre-kindergarten through an equivalent through high school, and others, parents who've said, hey, we're comfortable, and they do it for certain grades or a certain period of time, and then they move their child into a different school environment, whether it's public or private. But the key word there is choice, that people get to choose, just like you and I would get to choose which gas station we put gas in our car or what grocery store we buy our groceries at.
And to be clear, we're talking about parents choosing for their kids, not, I mean, maybe by the time children get to high school, they might weigh in a bit, but, you know, we're talking parents taking responsibility instead of bureaucrats.
Well, I think the key thing is that the choice is with the family and with the educational consumers as opposed to a geographic construct set up by the government. And that's why we have the interesting school district boundaries, Bob, where you can literally cross the street in West Wichita and you can move whether you're in the Wichita School District or maybe Goddard or Mays, and
you've never a plain old city street.
And you've never left the city of Wichita at that time.
Yeah. And one argument against school choice, I should say, is that charter schools and private schools are not held accountable. The education bureaucrats believe that only they can properly evaluate schools, and parents simply do not have the technical know-how to evaluate whether their children are being properly educated. Now, I think that's a really troublesome argument because a lot of the times they're talking about minority and low-income families, that those people cannot judge whether their kids are getting a good education. Worse than that, though, we found out that for many years, the Kansas education establishment was saying, Kansas kids do fine. Look at these scores on the Kansas state tests that they take. We found that those tests were completely a sham and that the education establishment was really lying to us about how well Kansas kids were doing.
Well, you've got to have norm-referenced standardized tests, and I'm not aware, and there may be some homeschool families out there that don't do it, but I'm not aware of any charter or private school students that aren't involved in taking standardized tests, and most of them are norm referenced so that you can have some measurement in terms of how the students are performing and what educational attainment levels they've achieved.
Yeah, and I do think that parents are much more interested in how their kids are doing than government bureaucrats, wherever they may be. So that's the one thing that I worry about quite a bit. Besides the state just lying to us, they are just not as interested in kids as parents are, I think.
Well, you've got to look at the incentives in terms of who's really focused on it. Are you going to be more concerned about your children as opposed to somebody who lives on the other side of town?
Exactly right. So
whether they're the principal or school superintendent, they may be knowledgeable and they're certainly may be concerned, but you know, if they're a principal of a school of 1,200 kids.
Yeah. Well, hopefully there will be some action on school choice this year in Kansas. Not hopeful. The governor has never really stood up for that and put his political capital on the line. He has none now, probably, but I really fear we may be even going backwards. Karl, there's another event that happened in Topeka this week I'd like to talk about. We'll be back to Wichita Liberty TV in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Karl Peterjohn. So something else that happened this week in Topeka on Tuesday, and I was involved in this, is there was a committee hearing about civil asset forfeiture. Now this is a process whereby if you are suspected of a crime, let's say you get stopped by the police or whatever, and there's some money in your car, and the police say, well, where'd you get that money? Why do you have so much money? If they have a whiff that money came from an illegal operation like drugs or something like that, they can take that money. Not only just seize it and as evidence in a court trial, they can just keep it, even if you're not convicted and even if no charges are filed. So there's a move by some people to reform that, primarily to require a criminal conviction before this property could be forfeited and then remain property of the state. Gail Finney, representative, a Democrat from here in Wichita, asked if I would come and testify, and I did that. And one of the points we made is that the Institute of Justice does a report called Policing for Profit. It's in its second edition, and Kansas has some of the most awful, I should say bad criminal asset or civil asset forfeiture laws in the country. In other words, stacked against people.
Well, the fact is that legal tender laws and laws on money, it's ironic that that they get used in ways that get pulled into both federal and state court cases.
Yeah. So there was a number of people there. Commissioner Richard Ranzoff, friend of ours, went with me too, and he testified on behalf of himself personally, but also fellow Commissioner Jim Howell. Lined up against us, though, was, I hope I never need a cop in Kansas again, Karl, because, there were representatives from the district attorneys, there was a colonel from the Highway Patrol, there was Sedgwick County Sheriff Jeff Easter. Besides being that, he had some sort of organization, Wichita Police Chief Gordon Ramsey, and just others all up and down the line.
Perhaps the Sheriff's Association for...
Whatever it was, saying we must have this tool. And interestingly, Gordon Ramsey told Richard, he's Wichita Police Chief, he told Richard, the county had some money stolen from it. Now they've made an arrest. Maybe they'll recover it or whatever. But the Wichita Police Chief told Richard and I that suppose this guy gets off on a technicality, that means Sedgwick County would not get their money back if this reform bill passed. And I thought, wait a minute, if he gets off on a technicality, that means he wasn't found guilty in the eyes of the law.
Well, you'd still have the possibility, I presume, of a civil action in terms of getting the money back, point one. The second thing that I think about it, Bob, in terms of the case you've outlined, is who in the government gets the money. If is it the police or the sheriff's office? Is it the district attorney's office, or is it perhaps the government's general fund?
Well, in Kansas, it's the police agencies themselves. And there was the law in Kansas, I think, says they're not supposed to use it for ongoing expenses. But last year, Legislative Post Audit found that some police agencies were doing that. They were counting on that revenue in their budget for normal routine operations like salaries and so forth. At the hearing, one member of the committee asked, I think the colonel from the Highway Patrol, well, what if we change the law so that the proceeds go to the state general fund rather than to the Highway Patrol, the Wichita Police Department, whatever? And he said he would not mind that. So that would be a first reform, and it would take some of the profit out of the policing, because the policing would be done for the profit of the state general fund, which is not nearly as much interest as the Wichita Police Department slush fund, I think.
Well, if it doesn't go to that agency directly involved, you've got the independent third-party nature that if you're involved in a criminal or civil judicial case, of having a arm's length relationship as opposed to a person simply saying, well, here's X number of dollars, we want it back. I understand, obviously, from the criminal end, they're sitting there saying, well, wait a second, the person involved says, I have no idea where this money came from. It just happened to be here in the vehicle or whatever it was that was being covered. And I think that there's, obviously, we don't want to have a system where you have policing for profit, but the key thing I view it is trying to keep this community safe at a reasonable cost, but also protecting the principles that this country was founded upon. And you've got to look at it from a Fourth Amendment, being safe in your people. We've had cases of people, just because they had large sums of money on them, having had it confiscated and then having to go to court to try and get their money back.
Had a huge burden to the rightful owner of the property just because they had a lot of money. Well, I feel that the testimony of all those law enforcement officials is pretty persuasive, at least to the legislators, and I'll be surprised if this bill advances. So we'll know before too terribly long. So, Karl, we've run out of time for this week on Wichita Liberty TV. Remember, check wichitaliberty.org. I'll post some show notes there so you can find out more about the issues we've talked about today. I'm Bob Weeks for Karl Peterjohn.